Hi, welcome to yet another edition of the Halal Food Podcast. Today we've got Professor J Regenstein from the US. I'm going to invite him to introduce himself, and we will be discussing some very important issues around welfare, around how to improve knife sharpness, how to restrain animals during religious slaughter. So without further ado, I invite Joe to introduce himself. Joe.
Hi, everyone. I'm a Professor Emeritus of Food Science at Cornell University, where I head an small organization called the Cornell Kosher and Halal Food Initiative, which is meant to help serve the industry, consumers, the government, and the religious communities to work together to deal with all of the issues that come up with halal and kosher in the real world. I do teach a course on kosher and halal, and despite being supposedly retired, I teach kosher and halal at Cornell in person once a year, and I teach online at Kansas State University.
Wow.
All 3 semesters. So I have been working in kosher halal since about 1978, mostly originally with food issues, and in the last 20 years or so have also been focused on the religious slaughter of animal issues from mainly a scientific. But once you're involved in something like that, you also have to be involved a little with the politics of this and the interaction with the larger society again. Those are my main area of work in this arena. When I'm not doing this kind of work, I work mostly with fish and fish byproducts. And my last set of work has been with fish gelatin, which is a wonderful material in that it's a byproduct. So I'm using waste, which feels good. I'm a protein chemist by original training, and gelatin is a fascinating protein. But the business side of it is that the major users of fish gelatin are the kosher and halal markets, where either porcine pig gelatin or beef gelatin that comes from unreligiously slaughtered animals is often not accepted. So both communities also accept typical fin fish without any question of the source of material. Obviously, the processing also has to meet kosher and halal rules. So my career has integrated kosher and halal into my research program.
That is wonderful. That's a kind introduction, and it's fascinating to see the areas you are involved in. So you mentioned the Halal and Kosher initiative. It's not common to hear a university having a Halal and Kosher program or even a Halal and Kosher initiative. What was the brain behind this?
When I first started getting into kosher, and I did start with kosher first, and then over time evolved into including halal when we had an incident that drew the 2 communities together. But going way back to the beginning, I started teaching a single lecture on kosher in the meat science course. And being an untenured professor, it made sense to try to get a publication out of it. Because I looked and there was very little out there that was useful. And once I wrote the paper, it was like a floodgate.
Wow.
There was clearly an industry dealing with kosher. There were government agencies whose work, the Meat Inspection Service, the Food and Drug Administration, where issues came up that had kosher and halal implications. And so it became clear that we needed to, particularly in what we call extension, which others would call outreach, that we needed to have some place where people knew they could come for help.
Yeah.
And that was the genesis of this concept. In addition, the halal came in with one of those really oddball things that happens in kosher and halal, which is something is going on, in this case, 3 steps removed from what anybody was paying attention to. And what was happening is that steel sheet, rolls of steel that eventually would be made into cans and 55-gallon drums, needed to be coated to prevent it from rusting. And it turned out that the manufacturer of the coating didn't need an ingredient statement, and they bought a lot of ingredients, sold it to the steel makers, and nobody paid attention to it. But the supplier to the formulator of the coating, who was selling to the steel maker, who was making cans for food,
Yeah.
it was loaded with pork. One of the ingredients was basically pork-based. And the steel company said, there's no problem, there's no pork. The manufacturer said, there's no pork. And the rabbis went and did their checking of all the ingredient suppliers. And that's when we found out, yes, there was pork in there. And so the Jewish and Muslim communities working with the steel industry has dealt with that problem. And that brought the two communities together. And I got to really get involved with Dr. Chaudhry at the Islamic Food and Nutrition Council, which is our largest Muslim certifier. Yeah. And he and I have now become friends. I'm actually on some of the committees of AFANCA, which is an interesting position for a Jewish fella to be in. Yeah. And we work together, and we've now published a lot of articles on kosher and halal together. And I've had the honor of being asked to edit the 2 full books that Dr. Riaz and Dr. Chaudhry have written on kosher and halal. Again, has been a wonderfully productive collaboration. Nice. But that's how it all happened. And then I had the honor of being IFT, the Institute of Food Technologists' first Congressional Science Fellow. So I spent a year in Washington and got to know some folks. I also worked on an issue of coating of fruits and vegetables, where again, pork was showing up. And so I had been involved with the Food and Drug Administration on that issue and some of the agencies in Washington, and then spent a year. And then all of a sudden, the supermarkets decided it was time to do something about animal welfare. So in around 1999, 2000, the supermarkets and chain restaurants put together an animal welfare committee. Temple Grandin, who I hope you've spoken about in the past, was on that. One of the people from the animal activist groups was on the committee. One of the animal welfare philosophers was on the committee, and a few other animal scientists. Yeah. But they realized they wanted to tackle religious slaughter, and they didn't really have anybody. But somebody said, "Oh, I know that guy up at Cornell," and I got dragged into slaughter issues, which I had avoided up till then. And the last 20 years, I've been worked with the FMI, Food Marketing Institute, and have now been working and we are working on the second edition as right now of the American Veterinary Medical Association's Humane Slaughter Guidelines. So the Veterinary Society in America has decided to take leadership and again to take a philosophy that I feel very strongly about, is to address religious slaughter, but to be sure we're doing it consistent with the religious requirements. And I think that is so important, and sometimes, unfortunately, from the European perspective, is lacking, is that the scientists are not interacting in a positive way with the religious community to work together to get the buy-in from both sides on how do we make religious slaughter the best it can be, and maybe even make it better than it is now by using the science consistent with the religious requirements. So that's a long answer to a simple question.
But that was worth it. That is giving us a good picture of trying to answer the question. Now, you've just asked, you've also mentioned scientists not interacting with the religious community in a way that will bring a better understanding of both sides. How do you think we can achieve that? Do you think scientists should talk more to the community? They should invite them to even research so that they can understand the nuances of religious slaughter, to be able to comply during research, because you can't just conduct research and expect the religious community to adopt it blindly. How do you think we can improve relations? Yeah.
Well, that's been one of the roles of the initiative, is to educate. I mean, again, we need education on both sides. And one of the things I see the initiative's role is to educate scientists about what are kosher and halal, and what are kosher and halal slaughter of animals in particular.
Yeah.
I see my other role as working with the rabbis and the imams and the mullahs and the scholars to educate them about the science, to get them to understand why we want ideally upright, why we care about animal welfare. And it's, again, if we do it well, it's consistent with both Jewish and Muslim thought, the importance of animal welfare. Again, they nuance it in different ways, but basically, if we work together, and I think the whole history of Temple Grandin is a good example of that, where she has worked closely with the rabbis and the imams and the Muslim community to do this, not trying to fight it, but to work together and say, okay, what is acceptable? How do we make that work best? As scientists, we're somewhere between scientist and engineer. And again, I don't make a big distinction between the two. Part of what science is about is problem solving. So if there is a problem in religious slaughter, how do we solve it? How do we make it better? How do we design our equipment, our knives, all of that stuff, so it really, really works in a real slaughterhouse with religious slaughtermen and regular slaughtermen, because some of what we learn can be translated to those folks also. But again, there are differences in religious slaughter. How do we take that into account and adjust best practices to reflect that and to give us good animal welfare? I teach animal welfare. I have started 2 courses on animal welfare. One that I continue to teach in part, I don't own the course anymore, in animal science, and one in the vet school that I pushed for and I give a major lecture in. So I'm very committed to animal welfare, but I'm also committed to maintaining religious slaughter.
Yep.
And I don't see any inherent problem if the two communities would work together and the religious community accepts the idea that in the context of both of our religions, there is no negative aspect of animal welfare as long as it doesn't violate a fundamental religious law. Animal welfare is an important part of both of our religions.
Yep.
We respect it. We want to do it right. So how do we do that?
Thank you very much, Joe. In your opening statement, you mentioned this thing twice. You said bringing the two communities together. So bringing the Muslim and the Jewish community together to improve the slaughter process. How do you think we can actually bring, or we can sort of try to improve our workings so that the Muslims can take some of the good practices from the Jewish community, and the Jewish community could also learn something from the Muslim community? In what ways do you think we can work together?
I think we are beginning to work together.
Okay.
One of the things I was very pleased of and very proud of is I actually spent a week working in and as a part of the Muslim Council of Britain. I actually basically went to the office every day.
Wow.
And much to my surprise and tremendous honor, at the end of the week, it happened to be a week where they had a major event scheduled with the community.
Yeah.
And at the end of the week, they said, well, you've been working on this, year is up to date. As anyone, you will be our spokesperson. So there I was at a meeting of the Muslim community, probably about 150 people, speaking as a representative of the Muslim Council of Britain. I also have worked with the Muslim Council and Shechita UK, which is the Jewish organization in the United Kingdom that has been working to protect the Jews' right to Shechita, the Jewish form of Tabiyah, equivalent to Tabiyah, and brought the two groups together for what was a very productive conversation, with the realization that sometimes we have to put other issues far away, because the fact is, when it comes to the religious slaughter of animals and a few other issues like circumcision and head coverings, Muslims and Jews are tied together in the eyes of the rest of the world. Whatever differences we think we have, the world sees us as doing things that they can attack us on in both communities. And if halal slaughter goes, so will kosher. If kosher goes, so will halal. So our right to do slaughter and those other issues are tied together.
Yeah.
We need to talk to each other. And I think, again, this conversation and the fact that you and I have been in touch, and the mailing list I maintain that goes across communities, is a start. I have a vision, and I've shared it with you in writing, of what a major program would be like to improve halal slaughter. One of the things I also think we could see more of, that the Muslim slaughtermen do, I believe, a little bit better than the Jewish slaughtermen, is the degree of aggressiveness. Now, again, the Jews are more sensitive about their knife, but watching Muslim slaughtermen, there's a confidence and aggressiveness that Temple has witnessed. And of course, she is the greatest person at visually seeing these things from an animal's perspective and from the animal welfare perspective. And there is a real benefit to being more aggressive. in terms of an animal becoming unconscious more quickly. So that is certainly an area where I'd love to get some of our slaughtermen, not all of them, some of them are pretty good, but most of them are a little more gentle. That actually ends up not being as good from a welfare point of view. And that's an area where I think we can learn something from the Muslim community.
Thank you very much, Joe. You wanted to say something?
Well, at some point, I'd like to get into a little more of the technical side of this as
Yeah.
part of it.
Yeah. So thank you very much. So another area that is very important, which I would like to get your thoughts on, is the area of pre-slaughter restraint. We know in some parts of the world, animals are still restrained, even large animals, by hoisting them by the hind leg. Some countries, including the UK, do not allow restraining of animals in any other position than in the natural standing position. Let's take cattle, for instance. I wanted you to go through these methods of restraint. So first of all, hanging animals by the hind leg, hoisting them by the hind leg, restraining them in a rotating position, either on their side, on their back, or slaughtering them in a standing position. I want you to dissect these methods and tell us which one you would rather recommend for the Muslim and Jewish communities.
Good question. And let's get straight to the point that shackling and hoisting is far from ideal. It is clearly one of the things that both Temple and I, certainly for cattle, absolutely don't accept and totally support efforts at it. It is not required by religious law. It came about simply because that was the equipment in the meat plant. One of the issues is that the religious community has to invest in proper restraint devices. Ideally, upright is better from a point of view, we believe, of animal welfare, and I'll explain in a minute. And two, the restraining device is actually less costly. Upside down has a definite religious preference in certain parts of both communities. And Temple and I both have come to respect that. The problem with upside down is it requires equipment to get the animal upside down.
Yep.
So you not only have to have a restraining box, you have to have a restraining box that turns itself upside down.
Yeah.
That adds a lot of expense. Also, turning an animal upside down has some challenges. The design of the box has to be very supportive. So it needs to be much more carefully designed and probably add some mechanical aspects.
Yeah.
So again, that adds to the expense. We have now upside down boxes that are terrible, and those deserve to be banned. And if you look at the research in the scientific European community, a number of studies have used the Weinberg pen in one plant in the UK.
Yeah.
That is a terrible piece of upside down equipment. It is almost as if the scientists selected it because they knew it was a bad piece of equipment and they wanted to attack us. There are good pieces of equipment, and there's work going on, and you had one of the people involved in that kind of work, Felipe Kleinman, on your program earlier. That needs to be optimized, and that's a place where the science, engineering, and religious communities need to work together to optimize upside down. We prefer, both Temple and I do believe that upright is easier and slightly better, but not by that much. So that, again, done well with with the proper equipment, turning fast enough, slaughtering immediately, because one of the things Temple has observed is if you turn the animal over fairly quickly and slaughter fairly quickly, there may be a refractive period where the animal hasn't realized what's happened yet. It's about, she estimates, and it's an estimate at this point, about a 10-second window. So it's important that if we're going to do upside down, that the religious slaughter person be ready as soon as the animal's upside down. And that was one of the things I observed. I had the opportunity to be in a plant where both Muslim and Jewish slaughtermen were working together.
Okay.
They alternated because, again, of some of the latter steps in the Jewish, they needed to space the animals. So they were only killing every fourth animal kosher, and the other three animals were being halal. And what I noticed is that, and liked, was that the halal slaughterman was an upside down box. As the box was turning, and that's another place where we can use the Muslim learning, he started his cutting. So he was cutting while the box was in motion with the animal's head properly restrained. And that's important if you're going to do any of this, particularly upside down, is that the head has to be restrained properly. But he was doing it sooner, and therefore his cut was finished very quickly. And that goes back to both the aggressiveness and being willing to do it as it was turning. Now, I don't think if the box is restrained correctly that the kosher would have a problem. I have not sat down with the rabbis in detail to look at trying to start the process slightly sooner. But again, where seconds are important, that is something else we need to look at. So, but that is exactly the kind of places where watching each of the two teams, we may get some ideas that, again, improve the practice. I'm not saying that at the moment there's room for improvement, as there is in secular slaughter. There's been a lot of improvement.
Absolutely.
But we need to continue to do good research. And again, one of the things that bothers me in the research of a set of papers, and I'm going to name names, that are associated with Dr. Gibson at Bristol, is that they used a
Dr. Gibson is at Royal Veterinary College.
Right. My error on that one. Right. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
His paper uses a machine sharpened knife in those key papers that are being cited in European parliaments. That has nothing to do, certainly, with kosher slaughter, and it's not a recommended knife for Muslim slaughter either. So again, taking data, using bad equipment, using a bad knife is not working to improve it. It is being used as, unfortunately, those papers, I believe, were meant to be, to make kosher and halal slaughter look bad. And that's one of the things that I find unfortunate about some of the work in Europe, is that it's not collaborative and not being done with the idea of how do we get to best practices and how do we make best practices better. And that certainly is both Temple and most of her disciples, and I consider myself in this arena one of her disciples. This is our role, is to make it better, consistent with religious rules. And I keep re-emphasizing that because that is so important and is lacking in much of the research being done outside the United States.
Joe, you mentioned a very, very important point, which I would like clarification on. You mentioned that in Gibson's paper, the knives were sharpened with a machine. Can you clarify that during Shechita slaughter, Do the rabbis do the sharpening themselves on a stone, or do they at any point use an equipment, a sharpening machine to sharpen the product? So that at least our listeners will understand what the differences are.
Not only do they use whetstones only, they check their knife after each kill. Between
Wow.
each kill, they recheck their knife. And the important thing is not only the sharpness, but one of the key areas we're talking about is the absence of nicks. A kosher knife is absolutely smooth, and I can pull up some slides to show you testing knife sharpness and its importance and what it's nick-free. And the final whetstone they use is diamond embedded, is extremely expensive, but is really, really sharp. Much of the training of Jewish slaughtermen is focused on knife sharpening. It is so critical. They will use a series of whetstones. And if I could, I'm going to pull up the share screen and let me go both through knife sharpness and nicks and really go through this in a little bit of detail.
Yep.
You're listed as host disabled participant screen sharing. You need to pull up your screen share.
That's a good. Hold on. How do I enable?
Under share screen, there's an arrow that should come up.
One participant can share at a time. Okay, yeah, I've done it now. Hopefully, you should be able to share.
Yep.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see some pictures so that at least our viewers can appreciate what you're talking about.
Yeah, let's go through a couple of them to cover both this issue and where we came from. So let's do the restraint device. I want to make a few points also about restraint devices. Okay, this is a knife that we designed with folks at Spirit of Humane in Wisconsin that is meant for the Muslim community. It actually says halal on it, which may or may not be appropriate, as we learned afterwards. But the point here in terms of knives is that it is a very long knife. It is very straight. And this is meant for sheep. And again, my pictures, because doing research is a lot easier on sheep, I will want to show some sheep equipment, which can be modified. This has a somewhat ergometric handle. I don't think it's been optimized for holding a knife for long periods of time to do slaughter. And again, for upright slaughter, I do believe that if this were on a slight angle, it would actually make it easier for the slaughtermen. So I do believe there's room for some ergometric research, because if people don't get tired when they're slaughtered, they'll do a better job. So that's important. In terms of restraining devices, this is one that we designed with Temple Grandin's help, and it has a number of features that are important. One are that the sides are solid. That's important both for the animal and for halal slaughter. Not seeing other things keeps the animal calmer. According to halal traditions, the animal should not see the knife being slaughtered. So the slaughterman can stand on the side and do his final sharpening of his knife so the animal doesn't see it. So it serves both purposes. The double rail here, and I assume my arrow is showing on the picture.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah.
Good. Oops. The double rail is something that Temple has designed with equipment that can be used for religious slaughter at 215 animals an hour. And what it does, and is fascinating to see is when you put an animal well supported, either with the V restraint that is used in many of the Muslim slaughterhouses I've been in, or for cattle or sheep, when you put them on the double restraint and lower the floor, which this system has a lowering system, you can actually watch the animal calm down. A well-supported animal with its feet off the ground literally calms down. We had a rambunctious ram that I thought was going to break the equipment. When we put it in on the double rail so it feels well supported, dropped the floor down, it became calm. So there's really a lot you can do, again, in the design of this kind of equipment. And this, of course, is meant for small scale sheep slaughter, which is very popular in the Muslim community. The other thing that's important here is that the floor, which Temple makes a big point about, is very, very busy because it's a non-slip floor. So again, the concept here is to have a non-slip floor as the animals are coming in. Now, this equipment has, which is not shown, we've tried to design some equipment to bring the animal on. Most of the cases in the laboratory, which this is Cornell's slaughterhouse, we simply brought one animal at a time, and it was easier not just to sort of bring the animal up. But again, solid sides, double rail, lowering the floor, that's non-slip. And here, here is a picture. This is yours truly being kissed by a goat. We were not slaughtering that day. This is out in Wisconsin. But again, all the concepts. And even a goat, which is a much more rambunctious animal generally than a sheep, was relatively calm and looking around once its feet were off the ground. And it was nice to get kissed.
That is a very powerful picture. It's a very powerful picture.
Okay. One of the things we've done, and this happens to be in Persian, is we have accepted the idea of small-scale slaughter. Muslims in particular, and I wish you and everybody who is listening, Ramadan Mubarak.
Ramadan.
We're in the middle of Ramadan, and at the end of Ramadan, many people are going to want to slaughter a sheep or a cow. And they will do it on very small scale, meaning all in one animal at a time. And so we have developed in multiple languages, handling sheep and goats. We do use one of our restraining pens, but we also show people that if they are alone, they should move the animal against a wall and mount the animal again to help calm it, and then lift the animal and do the cut. And again, for this kind of cutting, there may be some benefit in designing the knife a little bit differently again. Mm-hmm. These two pictures, one of the things we learned in America, we had some problems with, is what to do with the offal when you clean out the animal. In many of traditional countries, the offal is just thrown out to the feral dogs who will eat it. But in communal living, sometimes the dogs are not feral, they're people's dogs. And they then were coming into people's homes, dragging the offal of a sheep. And that did not work well with their non-Muslim neighbors. And so we're trying to teach them a little bit about how to compost offal, which is the easiest way in small scale to get rid of offal.
Yeah.
This is the knife sharpness testing developed by a company called Anago in Hamilton, New Zealand. you put the knife, and of course, this knife is much smaller, and the equipment, we've talked to the manufacturer, and he has visited us, and we'll show you a demo. This equipment is a little too small for the kind of knives I'd like to see us all use.
Yeah.
But the idea is the knife starts up on top. So the blade, so as you move it down, the first thing that goes into the equipment is the front of the blade. And then the equipment goes along the blade. As it's coming down, it is cutting this film. And that allows you to measure the force for cutting. So the sharper the knife, the less force you need to cut this very special film. It's part of the patent and uniqueness was designing both the equipment, but a lot of the work went into designing this proper film. And this film then gives you a measure of the knife sharpness. And this is a tracing of the knife you see,
Yeah.
which is not a slaughter knife. We'll come to that in the next slide.
Yeah.
And you will notice two things that are important. The first is what they are emphasizing, which has more to do with carpal tunnel syndrome and things like that. Many of the meat plants are using this equipment to help their workers do a better job of sharpening the knife because they're working with a knife all day cutting meat. And a sharp knife is a better knife, is a safer knife. And what they found is that traditional sharpening, you have a region that you do well, but it's very hard to sharpen the two ends. And people are not sharpening them. Mm-hmm. The other thing is you'll notice how noisy the trace is. And I want to come back to that in the next picture.
Yeah.
This was taken at Cornell with the help of Inago. We actually had the Inago equipment in the lab. And let's start with this knife. This knife was the knife I just showed you. Not the last one, but back the halal knife.
Yeah.
This is my halal knife. I had never sharpened it. It had been sharpened a little bit when it was made, but not seriously.
Yeah.
And you can see it was very not sharp and it is very noisy. We did this at a workshop. We had a Jewish slaughterman called a shochet who had come with his own knife.
Okay.
And this is a sheep knife. These are all again meant for sheep.
Yeah.
And what we learned is that the equipment at the two ends has problems because the knife is too big. So ignore this. This is an artifact of thing. But notice this knife's relative sharpness along its entire length. But more importantly, notice how smooth the curve.
Yeah.
We believe that some of that is the absence of nicks, which is where the pain will come in using a religious knife, is when the nick interacts with the skin. The sharp knife will give you a pain-free cut. A nick will cause pain.
Yeah.
And this is the knife below. We had told the shochet to bring his whetstones. He spent 20 minutes with his whetstones, sharpening this knife. We said it was just before lunch. He said, we've got to go to lunch and we need to pack up this equipment because Peter needed to pack it up and leave because he was going to the client who was actually getting this machine. We sort of were pre-testing that everything was working for the client. And he said, this knife still has nicks. And this knife is not as sharp as I wanted. I need another 20 minutes to bring it there.
Wow.
So his initial sharpening was somewhere between 40 minutes and an hour is what he plans when he initially sharpens his knife. And he did have the diamond whetstone as the last stage. So you can see he did a tremendous job of sharpening the knife but it was, from his perspective, totally unacceptable for slaughter. And that's what we need to teach Muslim slaughtermen. We need to get somebody to make many of these knives at a reasonable cost. We need to put together a set of whetstones. We need to put together a training video that can be at least subtitled in multiple languages, and move towards that longer straight knife. And Temple believes that that longer straight knife allows for a much better cut. And to the best of my understanding, talking to the Muslim community folks and slaughtermen, there's absolutely no requirement for the shape of the knife in Islam. The knife has to be sharp, and one has to do a continuous quick cut. And again, that continuous quick cut, you've heard me more than once already support that, but I believe that this kind of a knife would lead to some significant improvements, particularly if we could get this kind of level of sharpness that we see in the green line. One of the things we're proposing, and this is where I'm thinking big, but it's expensive and we need help from the community, is I don't believe we can have a tester every place. What I envision as a goal is to have one or two of these in each country that is doing religious slaughter, owned by, maintained by, and distributed by either ideally a religious organization such as the Muslim Council of Britain, which is not itself involved in slaughter, so it's a neutral party. It could even be the AHDB as a quasi-government. It could be a government agency, or it could be any one of a number of NGOs, would make this available for training sessions, would make it available for slaughterhouses to borrow for a week and to work with their slaughtermen to be sure they're maintaining their skill set. And I believe some kind of program like that would make this possible while not being prohibitively expensive. The equipment, the Inago tester, is expensive. I don't expect plants, though again, if they're a big enough plant, they should be using the tester with all the people with knives to improve the boning knives and the cutting knives for the base benefit of carpal tunnel and the safety of workers. I'm focused on this testing for slaughter knives, but in a real meat plant, there really is a need to test knives for carpal tunnel and worker safety. And again, if your meat plants have problems retaining its workforce, certainly the less stress you have in knife sharp in cutting, the easier the work is all day, the less you're going to have those problems. Again, it's a small part of helping to retain workers. So it does have other uses, though again, I'm emphasizing its use in religious slaughter. And I think that's the key set. Oh, this is, while I might as well do the slides all at once, this is a Temple Grandin head holder. The important piece here is, and this is for upright, this is an upright pen. The important point is to keep this area open so that the slaughterman, that's his working area. One of the things that Mr. Kleinman was talking about is we may need to let the animal move forward a little bit.
Okay.
So that we need to do some research. And again, there is room for research, is to move it a little forward to allow the slaughterman to possibly cut a slightly bit lower. And he makes an argument for slightly lower within the region that both religions permit the cut to be made. And we need to determine that. The other point that this picture shows is Temple has chosen an angle for this head holder that she, at the time she designed it, believed gave you the most tension. And the point being is when you're making a cut across the neck, you don't want the skin loose and flabby, and you don't want the neck stretched too far that once you have a cut, it will self-tear.
Okay.
So the angle of and tension that represents needs to be optimized. And Temple, in a discussion with her a few years ago, and it has been a few years ago, felt that maybe we need to rethink and do some work with small adjustments on that angle, which will have small effects on the tension, but could have fairly important ramifications on the quality of the cut. So again, this illustrates the degree to which Temple has paid attention to all these issues in slaughter, but it also represents the fact that once you've built a piece of equipment, it's harder to optimize, but we need to continue in a research mode to try to do that.
Yeah, just on this photo, Joe, you mentioned Felipe said maybe the cut should be, well, the neck should come out a little bit and the cut should be lowered a little bit. Now, Gregory and Co, they published a paper, I don't know which year was that, 2012, 2013, around that time. They said a higher cut position is actually better. It causes loss of writing reflex or total collapse. It promotes collapse. And we know collapse, when the animal collapses, is the start of the loss of unconsciousness. Do you think further research is needed here between what Felipe has suggested, a lower cut, and what Gregory and Co suggested in a higher cut?
I am familiar with that work.
Okay.
And the answer, the simple answer, and then I want to elaborate, is I don't know. That's why we do research.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems with that research is that some of the suggestions as to what they wanted to see violated the religious law because they were cutting above where you wanted to be. Felipe's argument is based on looking at the anatomical pictures, is that the blood vessels are larger slightly further down. And that helps to prevent the false aneurysms. That is one of the issues that some of the folks are raising, is that if you have a false aneurysm, bleed out is slow and the time to unconsciousness increases. And so there is room for research because ideally, particularly with cattle, we want to maximize time to unconsciousness. We want to get that as quickly as possible. Temple's data suggests that with a good cut, it's somewhere between 10 and 33 seconds with an average of around 17 seconds. And I think, again, if the animal is calm and if the animal is been killed with a sharp knife with no pain, there is even a very interesting hypothesis that we've talked about. It's a hypothesis. There is very little evidence other than basically observational, that if the animal is really calm, and that requires all the good handling practices that Temple emphasizes for all slaughter, quiet, calm, not jerky motions, etc., on the equipment, that the animal expires and may actually be releasing endorphins. The closest we have of evidence of that is anecdotal from people who tried to commit suicide using something like a very sharp razor blade, that there was no pain, and that they actually saw angels as they were expiring. Of course, they were caught in time by the medical people.
Okay, okay.
But it was not an unpleasant. They will report that it was not unpleasant. So in fact, I can extrapolate, and extrapolation is always dangerous. So again, it's an extrapolation of a hypothesis, which is really going out there. But if the animal does die with an endorphin release, which is also related to runner's high, with that kind of feeling, it actually suggests that a really well done religious slaughter might actually be superior to the industrial slaughter.
That is interesting. That is interesting. I have also read your paper that you published with Professor Temple Grandin, which was published in 1994. I've actually cited it several times, in which you made an observation of 3,000 formula fed calves that were slaughtered, I think, in 4 Shechita abattoirs. You emphasized that restraint was very important, and you also highlighted the fact that if it's restrained properly, the knife is sharp, the animals showed very little signs of distress or very little signs of pain. I think, look, we need to sort of promote these good practices in religious slaughter. I know, Shechita, you guys have done research. You've emphasized it time and time again. Where do you think halal needs to focus on? Do you think we should start with restraint? Do you think we should focus on knife sharpness, or do you think we should focus on the training of slaughter operatives?
Oh, that is a very hard question, because I want all of it. Yeah. I'm greedy. I really think we need to work on all 3 of those, and I don't think any one of these precludes the other. The knife sharpness and the training go hand in hand, so I don't see them. The question of restraining boxes is the question of the economics. Now, again, the piece of equipment I showed you, this for sheep, which of course is the bulk of Muslim slaughter, this equipment can be built by anybody.
Very simple.
It is less than $1,000 worth of material, US dollars, and even probably less. This is not rocket science. This is something a good welder, and one of the things I became aware of when I traveled actually in Kenya was that in almost any village, you have somebody who's a welder.
Yeah.
This can be done even in developing countries. This is not something that's that hard. The knife has to be made professionally. We have to find somebody to make large quantities at a reasonable price.
Yeah.
Again, in a very ideal world, some large Muslim charity or one of the larger, more wealthy Muslim countries would help to make this possible. But even with the knives people have access to, the sharpening, again, they probably aren't going to use a diamond whetstone, but I bet with a good video using a very fine whetstone and teaching people how to use more available and less expensive whetstones properly, we could continue to improve the quality of the Muslim knife. I work closely with a Muslim veterinarian in Bangladesh, and that's one of the issues he's trying to begin to address among many of animal welfare problems in a country like that is knife sharpening. Again, I think we can make real progress. recognizing again, and that's where, again, we need to be realistic short term, is we need to work with the communities. What do they have? How do we help them do it a little better? You can't walk in and say, well, I'm a scientist from America, and you've got to build this restraining box. You've got to get new knives. You got to spend money on a whetstone, and you got to spend a hell of a lot of money on an Inago sharpness tester. If I was able to do that, it would be wonderful. But I want to go in and say, okay, can we make a training video with help from something like AHDB, the Muslim Council, Afanka? Can we make a training video on sharpening knives better without the diamond whetstone? We still need some whetstones. We do believe people need to invest in a good set of whetstones, but the kind that are more normally available. That's a starting point. We need to make the plans for the simple restrainer more available. It is on the website that is listed. They originally wanted to build these. We figured out how to make them so you could pack them in an ordinary box and ship them around the world. Maybe somebody wants to do that. If they do, wonderful. But in the meantime, we're willing to give the plans out. So a welder should be able to do this. So again, we need to make increment steps.
Okay. Just a quick question on the restraint, Joe. Who owns the intellectual properties? Or are you not too keen on, if somebody, for instance, in Africa, I just came back from Ivory Coast and Ghana, where I saw animals being restrained in ways that are not good for their welfare. If somebody in Ghana wants to replicate these things, do they have to do the products have to be manufactured in America, or do the IP owner has to supervise it?
We have not patented it or copyrighted or any of that. That's why I give you the website, spiritofhumane.com. The plans are up there. What we want, and the people who help design this are Christians who feel the same way as I do. What they realized is that getting it to be manufactured was too difficult. The important thing is to improve religious slaughter. These drawings are available. The pictures are available for me. And again, we hope that people, as they work with this, make improvements. This is not the final perfect design, but we certainly encourage people to go to the site and to build these. It is much more important that they be built.
Nice one. That is very impressive. I will be discussing this with some colleagues in Africa to see if they will be interested in picking it up.
And again, if they're having issues or want to discuss it, you also have my email, which I normally put up. And you're certainly welcome to share with anybody who might want to be able to ask some questions. We do have I have in my brain, and I've talked with the guy who actually built this with me, ideas for how to do it for cattle. It does require probably something like a pallet jack. But again, I tried to design it using a piece of equipment that many food plants have access to and might use, rather than having to build dedicated engine equipment. It is upright. I don't think one can go to upside down with this kind of equipment, but we do believe that this could be scaled up for cattle, though we need some mechanical ability, and something like a pallet jack or a front end pallet lifter would provide that, and that is fairly widely available in many parts of the world.
Thank you very much, Joe. I want to divert a little bit into poultry before I come back. So poultry during halal slaughter in Europe in particular, the birds are shackled and inverted before they are slaughtered. This has been shown to impact on the welfare of the animal. What is the situation with Shechita? Do you do manual? Do you do shackling? Do you do cone restraint? What do you do? And what advice have you got for the Muslim community who continue to use restraint by shackling?
I grew up spending some of my summers on a poultry farm.
Okay.
We carried the animals upside down all the time as routine practice when we moved animals. There is some concern that some of the shackles, as the animals have gotten bigger, that when you put the foot in the shackle, there's pain. So I think, again, it's not, and this is typical. There's a problem. The Europeans say you can't do this. The American scientists say, wait a minute, the problem is that the shackles aren't working correctly. So what we need to do is correct the shackles, not ban things just because we feel like banning things. We need to correct it. So that's the first point. I have not spent enough time on slaughter. I have seen various types of religious slaughter, both in Europe and America. I don't have an inherent problem with shackling. I've seen the cones. I know that the largest slaughterhouse in the US, the shochet has a helper and does the cut with the animal upright. I have seen shochtim who prefer to actually hold the animal by the leg and do the cut while the animal is upside down. I think we, again, need to do good research without an agenda. Are there differences? Now, the problem here is doing this kind of research is difficult and expensive because you need to do blood chemistry, and obtaining the blood in this kind of situation is difficult. I think it can be done. I think at this point, I would spend more time again on, and I've seen some really good knives in the Muslim community. I worked with a slaughterhouse that here in New York State that was using a poultry scalpel, and the two Muslim slaughtermen who were from Africa were doing a marvelous job because we were actually measuring time to insensibility.
Okay.
Which is loss of the eye reflex, which is later than unconsciousness. And it went beautifully. When the knife stopped being good, they gave up on it. And they could kill some number of birds, and it varied depending, sometimes it was 100, sometimes it was 200. But they did a perfect cut every time, quickly and well. And that was upside down. That was on a shackle line.
Okay.
Again, I've seen good slaughter in all of the configurations. I don't think the configuration is the most important point. It is the knife and the slaughterman. And again, there are people who shouldn't be slaughtering, particularly Muslim and Jewish. I love them all. I suspect I would not make a good slaughterman. I have slaughtered animals in the laboratory. I'm not sure I could do a good job of religious slaughter. I was not doing religious slaughter. Some of us just shouldn't be slaughtermen. Unfortunately, if somebody trains and then wants to earn a living that way, how do you deal with that? But again, tactfully, you give that person a different job. But again, slaughtermen can be, and the good slaughtermen, probably there's room for improvement with training and their understanding. Maybe, for example, in that scalpel, they should give it up a little bit sooner and take a new blade. When do you give up your knife? Because as you keep sharpening it, people try to keep it. Is there a time where the knife really shouldn't be used anymore? Mm-hmm. I don't have any information on that.
Yeah.
But it's a question that needs to be asked. So again, My goal is to constantly be improving religious slaughter of animals and regular slaughter.
Yeah.
Taking the life of an animal should be done with respect. One of the beauties of religious slaughter is a human is taking the life. It's not a machine. It's not high-speed machines with no respect for the animals. It's a very respectful process. But as an actual process, it needs to be optimized.
Thanks again, Joe. In your last comment, you mentioned unconsciousness and sensibility. Now, one of the arguments against religious slaughter is the suggestion that during religious slaughter, when the neck is cut, when the neck of the animal is cut, unconsciousness is not immediate and animals can stay sensible for a longer duration of time. Now, what I want you to just take your time to explain is, look, during religious slaughter, do animals lose consciousness at some point? Is it immediate? Is it at what point is it? Some people will even link it to brain death. What are the technicalities in this so that people can understand what the differences are?
Doing religious slaughter does not lead to instant death.
Yeah.
Or unconsciousness. Mm-hmm. As I said, for cattle, which is the slowest animal because it has a little bit of blood vessels behind the neck that affect things.
Yeah.
Temple's data is that from 10 to 33 seconds with a proper cut, average 17 seconds, the animal becomes unconscious. Once the animal is unconscious, it doesn't feel pain. The point I made about endorphins and the hypothesis is that that's the period where you want to minimize stress and struggle of the animal. Once it's unconscious, there's no pain. So even if it's still bleeding and if it's kicking is not a sign of unconsciousness. Loss of posture is. Then it takes a period of time till it becomes insensible. Insensible is the loss of generally the eye reflex, which is why I said I was in a poultry plant studying the eye reflex. That is usually the last sign of insensibility, which Temple believes is equivalent to brain death. When you have insensibility, you can begin to process the animal. So part of the arrangement is once an animal is unconscious, you can hang it upside down if you want to. After that, you have to wait till it's insensible before you do anything else. And that needs to be enforced. Now, one of the things I know in Europe, they have timers, and when the timer goes off, they're allowed to move it. In most cases, that timer is too long, but we have to have a way of measuring unconsciousness in the slaughterhouse using modern sensors. Once the animal is unconscious, it should be able to be removed from the restraint. We also need to have some kind of system of checking for insensibility, and there should be nothing but hanging until the animal is insensible, it's brain dead, and once it's brain dead, it may be kicking. And one of the points Temple makes is the animal can be kicking, it can be moving. There are signs that there's return of consciousness that means the cut has not been done well, but it is not the kicking. The other point here is that if an animal is not unconscious by some time of 40 to 60 seconds, and that needs to be discussed, and at least in one country, it's by law 40 seconds, the animal does need to be put down with a stun system, a traditional stunning system. Any animal that is left more than a minute conscious is absolutely unacceptable. And so the fact that we have animals that have been documented to go beyond that is simply unacceptable. And a plant must have present a stunner that if the animal is not unconscious in let's use the most generous limitation, 60 seconds. Any data showing animals unconscious over 60 seconds, that is bad practice. That should be stopped. And again, what's interesting in many of those papers is they don't give you the mean or the average or anything like that. They give you the worst case. And sometimes if you let the animal go, they will go for, if they've had an aneurysm, they will go for 4 or 5 minutes. That is bad practice. It ought to be stopped, and it's probably everyone ought to accept that it's illegal, that after 60 seconds, the animal must be unconscious. And both Temple and I certainly support that. And it has worked out fairly well. Somewheres again, in Holland, it's that at some time you stun the animal. The data beyond 1 minute is being used to hurt religious slaughter. I think everybody agrees if it's a bad slaughter, the animal ought to be stunned. And if it is not halal or it's not kosher, so be it.
Yeah, yeah. My last question to you, Prof. Regenstein, is another area that divides opinion within the Muslim community, and I don't know whether it's the same within the Jewish community, is the issue of death. I've read on Professor Temple Grandin's website that death, the presence of a heartbeat is not a sign that the animal is alive. An animal can be dead for even 8 to 10 minutes and the heart will still be beating. Now, the difficulty within the Muslim community is some certifiers will say, oh, if there is a heartbeat, if the animal is stunned and there is a heartbeat, the animal is still alive. Now, I had a conversation with a certifier some years ago. He told me, oh, I'm using gas stunning. And I said, look, gas stunning will kill. He said, no, we measured heartbeat and there was some heartbeat present. Although, in my opinion, the animals, the birds were dead. Now, how do you define death? Do you define death based on the presence of a heartbeat, or do you define death based on the irreversible loss of function of the brain?
This is a real controversy in both communities. But in both cases, you have an interesting situation. Both religions treat human life as important enough that religious laws get suspended if human life is at stake. Heart death would prevent heart transplants. The Jewish community has kind of worked its way to brain death as the definition of death.
Okay.
Because of the need to save a life and the need to allow for heart transplant. Certainly in the meat plants, death is the brain death, which we operationally in a slaughterhouse measure by that eye reflex. Mm-hmm. The idea being that the frontal lobe, the most active part of the brain, is dead before you're allowed to do anything else. And that's the eye reflex. Again, if one religiously wants to wait for the heart, you still can deal with unconsciousness, but it means that a plant, in theory, cannot do anything but maybe shackle an animal for 8 or 10 minutes. I don't know that anybody wants to hire those certifiers. I think for animals, one has to work with the concept of brain death.
Okay.
Again, I'm not a philosopher. I'm not an ethicist in a formal sense. I can understand people who only want heart death. But as a practical matter, you cannot accept animal slaughter in a real sense and accept heart death. At the animal level, you really have to accept brain death. But again, I reiterate, until the brain is dead, you cannot do any cutting other than the religious cut.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Regenstein. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on this podcast. I've enjoyed it. I'm gonna listen to it time and time and time again, and I'm hoping people will listen to it. Even if somebody can just learn one thing you've said from the many, I think I would have achieved my aim.
Well, thank you for having me and giving me this chance. And I agree with you. One of the things one learns after having taught for a couple of 100 years is teaching is hard. And if students learn one or two things in a lecture, it's a winner.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. I will come back to you at some point. We will have to come back to you to discuss this topic again.
Happy to do so, but
All right.
appreciate it and look forward to working with you on other things that are of mutual interest.
Great. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.